I'm going to talk about our keynote, Ronnie Detrich. He has much to teach us with respect to implementation and decision-making. This particular report is available as a download at the Center for Innovations in Learning website. It's very easy to read, and in this report, Ronnie outlines 7 principles of successful implementation and practical suggestions for making database decisions, and I highly recommend you all download it and read it. Ronnie Detrich is a senior fellow at the Wing Institute, a relatively new foundation with a mission of promoting evidence-based practice in education. Prior to joining the Wing Institute, he was clinical director of a large non-public school for students with significant behavioral challenges for 20 years. He has been providing services for children and youth since 1967. During that time, he has served as a direct service provider as well as director of programs such as statewide autism programs in South Dakota and a residential treatment program for adjudicated adolescents in West Virginia. All of his work has been characterized by implementing evidence-informed programs and data-based decision-making. Most recently, his work has focused on the role of evidence-based practice in education reform, the implications of evidence-based practice as a decision-making process, and methods for assuring high levels of treatment integrity at scales of social importance. He is a trustee of the Cambridge Center for Behavioral Studies, a member of the Association for Behavior Analysis International Practice Board, and is on the editorial board for the Journal of Positive Behavior Interventions and Behavior Analysis in Practice. Oh, and he looks like a rock star. That's why I invited him in, of course. I met Ronnie in 1999 when I was a young graduate student trying to pay my way to a conference much like this one. I was selling t-shirts out of my backpack so that I could fund myself, and Ronnie was my first customer. We've been friends since. I have sought many opportunities to learn from Ronnie and have benefited from every single one of them, except for those that are on tennis. He likes tennis and I do not, so I don't learn that. He is incredibly knowledgeable about pretty much everything. He is wicked smart, but more importantly, wicked nice. He is a kind mentor and a humble leader. I am grateful for his careful shaping. When we first thought of the idea of this evidence-based practice conference, I knew that Ronnie would be our keynote when we were talking about implementation. That day has come. Please welcome Ronnie Detrich.
Okay, is this good enough? Can y'all hear? Okay, just give me a minute to set my timer up. I really do want to thank Trina and the committee for allowing me to be here. I had a great day yesterday talking with a number of you folks, and I was absolutely impressed with the scale of what many of you are trying to accomplish at huge systems level, statewide, which is an enormous and incredibly complex undertaking. And I tip my hat to you because I don't think I could do that. Certainly not at this age. I can barely walk, so, but I really do appreciate the opportunity. Yesterday, Karen set the stage by talking about implementation science, and she described it as talking about it from about 30,000 feet. Today, I want to talk about it from a much lower angle. We're going to travel about 5 feet above the ground at our highest points. I've been interested in treatment integrity since I started providing services, and at that time nobody talked about treatment integrity, but what I quickly discovered was that I spent a bunch of my career working with individuals and groups to develop powerful, effective interventions, and nobody implemented them, or they implemented them so poorly that change was unreasonable to expect. And I went through the usual stages. At first, I complained about folks not doing what they said they would do. I whined. I hid in the corner. I dismissed the whole enterprise and said, this is just nuts. And then I realized, of course, that implementing a program is behavior just like our students that we're concerned about. So somehow we have to figure out how to influence the behavior of the adults who are going to influence the behavior of the students. And then other people started talking far more intelligently about treatment integrity than I was, and I started paying attention to that. So what I want to do today is take a look at treatment integrity and see if there's ways that we can advance the conversation a little bit. Just move the needle some so that your learning curve isn't as flat as mine was for as long as it was. And I have several goals for today. First, I want to make the case that treatment integrity monitoring is a necessary part of service. It's not an add-on. It's a necessary part of service. I want to describe the dimensions of treatment integrity fairly briefly. I want to suggest a few methods for increasing the way interventions get implemented. And then I want to place treatment integrity inside a systems framework. But I want to start with a bit of wisdom I learned from Dean Fixon. Students do not benefit from interventions they do not experience. And that seems perfectly self-evident. But if you've been in the field long enough, you've watched any number of programs be adopted. People say that we're doing school-wide positive behavior support, but if you walk in and look, you see absolutely no evidence that they're doing school-wide positive behavior support. But if you ask them, they say they are. You can't benefit from things that you don't experience. So I want to keep coming back to that notion. So let's talk about the current state of treatment integrity in education. I want to talk about education because that's the world I live in. This stuff is pretty generalizable to any occupation that you may be in. When No Child Left Behind and then IDEA emphasized scientifically based instruction, everybody got on board. There was much greater emphasis on identifying effective practices than there was on how those practices might get implemented. So again, people started adopting evidence-based practices, empirically supported practices, but not implementing them any better than what they were implementing before the notion of scientifically supported interventions. One of the things that we've learned over time is that effectiveness studies, those studies where we have the researcher work at arm's length from the intervention, where it's implemented in the usual care settings by usual care staff, those interventions get much smaller effects than when researchers implement those same interventions. Same intervention, just a different sort of set of implementers, and effects get much smaller. The usual reason is that there's a lack of treatment integrity. And this isn't just about blaming implementers. I want to make that case up front. I'm not blaming implementers. That's why I want to talk about this as a systems perspective. Our mission, this is for Trina. I apparently have developed a reputation for 2x2 tables. This is at least one of the 2x2 tables you'll see today. What we're trying to do is find those interventions that give us the greatest probability of producing benefit for students. And there's two dimensions that we want to look at. We want to look at whether or not an intervention is empirically supported, but we also want to look at whether or not that intervention is implemented with sufficient integrity to make a difference. So we can adopt an empirically supported intervention, and we can implement it with high degrees of integrity. Then we have a high probability of benefit. Not a guarantee, but an increased probability of benefit. We can also take that same empirically supported intervention, but now we're going to implement it with low integrity. The probability of benefit goes away. It's the same intervention, just implemented so poorly that it's not likely to result in benefit. We can identify practices that have no empirical support, and there's hundreds and hundreds of them. Doesn't mean they're necessarily ineffective, just means they've not been evaluated. So you're adopting them on faith, in a sense. You can implement that intervention with a high degree of integrity. The probability of benefit is unlikely because there's a really good chance you're going to be implementing an intervention with no active ingredients in it. So how well you do something that doesn't have any effective components in it doesn't matter. You're going to get 0. And finally, you can have an empirically supported or non-empirically supported intervention and implement it poorly. And not surprisingly, you don't get benefit from that. So I would make the case that as service providers, we want to spend as much time as we can in this quadrant. It also makes the case that if you want to get benefit for students, we're going to have empirically supported interventions. They're necessary, but they're not sufficient to get outcomes. Because if they were sufficient alone, then we could get benefit in this quadrant, but we can't. So we also have to have high levels of treatment integrity. So both empirically supported interventions and treatment integrity are necessary. Neither of them alone are sufficient, because if treatment integrity alone was sufficient, we would get benefit over here. So you have to have both components if we want to have the best chance of having impact. And that's all I'm talking about. We're playing a probabilities game. How can we increase the chances of having impact? Now, I want to make an argument that implementing with integrity is actually an ethical responsibility. Most of us get paid by somebody else. State taxpayers, families, insurance companies, somebody's paying us to deliver services. When we enter into that arrangement, we've essentially assumed the role of being a fiduciary. And being a fiduciary, there's certain responsibilities. One, we have to act solely for the benefit of the other person, not for our benefit, because we're not getting paid for us. We're getting paid to produce outcomes for someone. Being a fiduciary carries the weight of ethical conduct, although many bankers seem to have forgotten that in the last decade. But they do have a fiduciary responsibility to us. And our responsibility is to assure that taxpayers, or whomever the funding source is getting the greatest possible return on their investment. So I think that we have to start thinking about making sure we're implementing our interventions with sufficient integrity that we're likely to get benefit. And that's an ethical responsibility. Now, I have just a couple of bits of data for you about how we're currently doing with monitoring and working to increase treatment integrity. In a recent survey of school psychologists, 97% of them said, yes, treatment integrity is important to consider. I'm a little surprised that there's 3% that go, nah, it's really not that important. But 97%. But out of that 97%, 9 out of 10 of them said, nah, I don't really measure it. It's important, but I don't worry about it. I don't measure it. 9 out of 10. So 9 out of 10 school psychologists are providing services for which they don't know how well their interventions are being implemented. I think that's problematic. Here's another bit of data that I find incredibly fascinating. Kathy Wickstrom and some colleagues did a study on treatment integrity, and they asked teachers to rate how many of these intervention elements did you implement. The average the teachers reported was 54%, which I don't know if that's good enough or not. I don't, but that's what they reported. The sad part is Based on direct observation, they only implemented on average 4% of the elements. So it would be hard to argue that they were actually implementing the intervention that they were being asked to implement. So let's talk about, since this is a conference focusing on evidence-based practice, I want to talk about evidence-based practice as a framework for decision-making and where treatment integrity fits in all of that, because treatment integrity is about helping us make decisions. And here's the logic chain. Data-based decision-making is at the heart of evidence-based practice, or evidence-based education. The impact of the movement of evidence-based practice and education is going to be determined by how well we implement specific interventions. The effectiveness of those interventions is going to be a function of the integrity with which they're actually implemented. The decisions we make about continuing treatment, changing treatment, is going to be directly linked to the quality of implementation. The logic continues. Student progress data tells us about the effects of the intervention. If we know something about treatment integrity, if we have data about treatment integrity, then we can make decisions about the adequacy of the intervention and the adequacy of implementation. If we have poor implementation, then we can focus on improving implementation before we make any decisions about the adequacy of treatment. If we have good implementation, then we can worry about changing our interventions so that we increase the probability of students benefiting. But if we don't know something about treatment integrity, we're guessing. And all of you, I'm sure, have thrown out programs because you weren't getting results, but you don't know if those results were a bad choice around interventions or poor implementation. So here's how it might work in your setting somewhere. We have a kid who's reading at the rate of 40 words correct per minute. Grade level standard is 120. It would suggest that intervention is necessary. So we put an intervention in place, and we get a trend line that looks like this. And go, okay, well, he's making progress. He's making progress at the rate of 1 more word per minute per week. Problem is, we'd set an aim line to get him up to grade level. That's going to require 2 words per minute per week. And this is just an example. Don't get worried about the details. So if we follow out the trend line, at the end of 25 weeks, there's still going to be a substantial gap between this student's reading level and grade level standard. Our analytical task is to figure out, did we select the wrong intervention or did we implement that intervention correctly? And here's a way we can start to think about how to answer that question. We start by asking, is the student making progress? If the answer is yes, check treatment integrity. Is it high or low? If there's not high treatment integrity, but the student's making progress, I would suggest as a practical decision, we continue to monitor progress, but continue the intervention. We're getting an effect, but we don't know why. But Don Bayer taught us a long time ago, it's easier to make things worse than it is to make things better. So if you're getting anywhere close to what you're shooting for, don't mess with it. Just don't. Now, the other option is you have great progress for the students, there's high treatment integrity, then your decision's very easy. Just continue the intervention. The trouble comes on the other side of the equation. The student's not making progress. You check for treatment integrity. Yes, there's high treatment integrity. So the decision, again, is very easy. Revise the intervention. Because now we know we have no progress, high implementation, so we got to do a different intervention. If there's no progress or limited progress and low treatment integrity, then our task is, before we make any decisions about the treatment, our task becomes to do something to increase treatment integrity. After we've done that, we check student progress. Is the student now showing benefit? If the student is showing benefit, we confirm that there's still high treatment integrity, and we continue the intervention. If there's student is making progress, there's not high integrity, monitor progress, continue the intervention, because we're still getting progress. Where it gets problematic is you've done things to increase treatment integrity, you've checked the progress, the students are still not making sufficient progress, you again check for treatment integrity. Is there high treatment integrity? Then again, the decision's easy, revise the intervention. If there's not high treatment integrity, don't do anything before you go back and do more work around improving the quality of implementation. Because if you don't improve the quality of implementation, you're still guessing at what the problem might be. You end up in that cycle till you can make a decision. As you can see, each of these boxes in red is a decision. Continue or revise, it's binary. But there's a lot of work that has to get done below the surface or in the background before you can make a good data-informed decision. And my argument is your decisions are going to be much better if they're data-informed than guessing about what's going on. I spent a good part of my career guessing, and I'm a terrible guesser, as it turns out. And that sounds all well and good, but here's the challenge we face in practical sense. Every time we do an intervention of any scale, it costs us. It costs us time, money, resources. If we're going to monitor treatment integrity and work to actually improve treatment integrity, it's going to cost us time, money, and resources. The problem we have in practice setting, resources are likely not to be added just so you can check for treatment integrity. You can't go to your boss, your supervisor, and say, look, we need many more staff, many more dollars, because it's an ethical responsibility to increase treatment integrity. Your supervisor is going to say, sure, I'll print up that money right now. So we're going to have to somehow make do with the existing resources. So now the question becomes, do we take resources from direct service delivery to support monitoring and improving treatment integrity? And I suspect when I first started down this chain, I thought, no, you don't touch services for students. That you're taking away. But then I thought a little longer, and when I talk longer, I mean I'm a slow thinker. It takes me a long time to get anywhere. But then I got to the point where I realized that failing to assure high-quality implementation is likely going to result in us wasting resources on services, because if we're not implementing well, we're not likely to get benefit. And here's one way to think about it. Services that aren't producing outcomes is the equivalent of activity without accomplishment. How many of you have time in your day just to do busy work? Because that's what this becomes. I don't have the time, I don't have the luxury. Surely our students don't have the luxury of us doing busy work. We have a finite opportunity to improve the quality of children's lives. Every year longer it takes to get to good services, effective services, the harder it is to turn the boat around. So I would make an argument from the beginning of providing services, we have an ethical responsibility to monitor treatment integrity. So what do I mean by treatment integrity, and what is it that we're supposed to be monitoring? Historically, treatment integrity has been defined as the intervention being implemented as planned. And that's been the working definition for a very long time, since at least the early 80s. More recently, folks have started thinking a little bit more systematically about treatment integrity, and they've broadened the dimensions of treatment integrity. Dane and Schneider proposed the first expanded model of treatment integrity, and there's a number of other models. Most of them are variations on Dane and Schneider's 1998 work, so I'm going to use it just to walk through pretty quickly. The first dimension of treatment integrity is exposure. Dosage, just is the student being exposed as they're supposed to be to this particular intervention? For example, a struggling reader might get additional support in reading 3 times a week, 30 minutes each time. So an extra 90 minutes of support per week. If we don't satisfy the frequency of sessions or the duration of the sessions, exposure has been compromised. If there's only one session for 30 minutes, we've reduced exposure by 2/3. That would be like you getting an antibiotic, and instead of taking all of them as prescribed, you take only 1/3 of them. And what's the chances you're going to benefit by taking only 1/3 of the antibiotics? Less than if you take all of them. A second dimension of treatment integrity is adherence, which is what the original definition was. Implement the intervention as planned. Most of us, when we're implementing, are implementing multi-component element or multi-component packages that our interventions have any number of elements built into it. And adherence is absolutely necessary to get effects, but it's not sufficient by itself. You also have to have exposure. If you implement perfectly, but only 1 time a week instead of 3, you're probably not going to get great benefit. Now, the first 2 dimensions I talked about are quantitative. They're pretty easy to measure. If you can count it, you can get measures of exposure and adherence. This third dimension, the quality of delivery, we've always recognized as being important. But for those of us who like to count things, we don't have very good ways of counting quality. Qualitative measures make some of us uncomfortable. They're squishy. You don't know what you're really measuring. But we have to understand that if there's poor quality, adherence or integrity is going to suffer. Benefits are going to suffer. Many packages you get for working with students include praise. And somebody can praise just perfectly, but they do it in such a monotonous way, no inflection in voice, no enthusiasm, no sincerity. And I don't care if you're sincere or not, but if you can fake sincerity, I'm good with that. But somehow we have to be able to measure these dimensions, qualitative dimensions of implementation. And I'm sure all of you have worked with individuals who are really great at praising, and you've also worked with individuals who just can't sell it. And it doesn't have to be, all of us don't have to be cheerleaders, because for some kids, that big, large personality is overwhelming, and the kid just retreats to the corner. So we have to measure quality with respect to the individual child. Now, the fourth dimension and the last dimension I'm going to talk about is responsiveness of participants. The other 3 dimensions are measures of adult behavior. This fourth dimension is a measure of students' behavior. And it seems odd because treatment integrity is largely about how well adults are behaving with respect to implementing the program. But think about this. I can bring that student to the supported readings program 3 times a week for 30 minutes. I can implement that program with incredible adherence. I don't miss a trick. I can be enthusiastic. I can be sincere. My voice range inflection goes from high to low. I'm doing everything perfectly, and the kid has his head down, her head down, is counting the holes in the tile in the ceiling, they are not engaged with the instruction at all. Going back to Dean Fixon's comment, students do not benefit from instruction or interventions they do not experience. It would be hard to argue that this student with their head down, counting the holes in the tile, is engaged and experiencing the intervention. We have to ask the student, so why aren't you engaged? What's going on? And it may be that we've placed the student at their frustration level rather than instructional level. We may have placed them at a mastery level instead of instructional level, and they're bored tiers. There's any number of reasons, but the only way we can really begin to answer that is to ask the student. So I would make the argument that student responsiveness is a dimension of treatment integrity. Now, again, I spent most of my life as a practitioner. And as practitioners, we're always operating within resource constraints. And it's going to be difficult to assess all dimensions of treatment integrity simultaneously. Measuring some of them require relatively few resources. So we shouldn't put lots of resources on measuring exposure, for example, because it's pretty easy to measure. You walk down to the classroom where the supported reading instruction is going to occur. Is the kid there? Did it start on time? 30 minutes later you come back. Is the kid still there? Did it end on time? So did they get 30 minutes? You don't have to worry about what went on in between. You're only worried about exposure. So I want to present a model for doing sequential assessment of treatment integrity that doesn't take all the resources in the world. So again, with this simple little flow chart, if you're getting poor outcomes, assess treatment integrity. And the first thing you do is assess exposure. If exposure is adequate, if they're doing that part, then you move on to assess adherence. But if exposure isn't adequate, you do things to increase exposure. Are there organizational variables that are getting in the way? Are there systemic issues that are keeping folks from being able to implement this program 3 times a week for 30 minutes a time? If there are, don't worry about adherence, fix exposure. Get rid of those organizational systemic variables that are disrupting implementation. Because if you don't take care of that, you're probably not going to get great benefit from your intervention. And it's not easy changing organizational variables. It's just not that easy. My wife is a special ed teacher. She orders materials off of eBay, reading materials off. That's shameful that she has to go to that level to get the materials that she needs. She's tried to get them out of the system and it has had zero impact. So we're now making non-tax deductible donations to the public school system so that she can get the material she needs to instruct kids. I'm happy to do it because they're pretty cheap on eBay. But it's shameful that we have to do that. But she worked around the organizational constraint rather than try to change it, because from her position, she saw no way to change it, and I wasn't about to go in as a volunteer and do systems change work with an entire school district. So we do our work to improve exposure. Then we check progress. Are we now getting benefit? If so, continue the intervention. If not, now you do have to monitor adherence. But you've taken care of exposure. You know that part's okay. Now you monitor adherence. Is it okay? If adherence is okay, then you move on to quality of delivery. But if adherence is not okay, you do things to increase the quality of implementation around adherence. Is it a can't do, won't do problem? Sometimes staff don't do the intervention because they actually don't know how to do it, but sometimes it's a won't do. The intervention is just not a good contextual fit. So we have to have conversations about how we can make it a better contextual fit so we get better adherence. Again, after you improve adherence, you check progress. Notice that progress is ultimately our test for how well we're doing. You check progress. If now you're getting good progress, continue the intervention. If you're not, now you have to assess quality of delivery. The logic holds the same. You check quality of delivery, it's fine. Then you move on to checking participant responsiveness. If quality of delivery is not fine, you do something to improve it, video modeling, coaching. As you move down, you see that the resources required are going to be a little more intensive. If you're getting benefit from quality of delivery, continue the instruction. But again, all of this is to get you to a point where you can make a decision and where you can identify what the problem is with implementation. So until you know what the problem is, you don't know what to fix. So that's why I would argue for this sort of sequential approach. And that's, when I was clinical director of our schools, that's kind of the logic system that we followed, because we didn't have the resources to just go in and spend all day observing to see what people were doing well and what they weren't doing. So I suggested that at any point where there's a disconnect between what the program the intervention says you're supposed to do and what you're doing, we have to increase treatment integrity. Well, then the question obviously becomes, what does it take to increase treatment integrity? The one thing we know, sadly, is that training alone is not sufficient to ensure high implementation. These data I stole from Dean and Karen, but I want you to pay attention, and she presented them yesterday. This is from research by Joyce and Showers, and what I want you to pay attention to is this column. The only thing that resulted in substantial transfer and implementation in the classroom was when training involved coaching, direct coaching in the classroom. So we have to figure out how to make that happen. We have two alternatives for approaching treatment integrity. We can let it happen, which is what we've historically done, and we have a really long history of not getting much benefit from it. It's the train and hope model. Let's just hope things work out for the best. And hope is a terrible plan. It's good to have hope, but it's not a plan. So I think you have to really move to another alternative, which is make quality implementation happen. To do that in practice settings, it's going to require that we have efficient procedures as well as effective. They can't be incredibly resource intense because we won't do them because we don't have the resources. There's beginning to emerge approaches that actually do increase treatment integrity. Right now, most of the work is at the level of individual support. How do we improve integrity around interventions for individual students or a very small group of students? We have to find ways to scale that up to whole classrooms, whole school districts, ultimately whole states. How do we get whole states implementing with integrity? And I'm not suggesting it's easy, I'm suggesting it's necessary to do. You're younger than I am, you're smarter than I am, you'll figure it out. The most common approach to increasing treatment integrity is performance feedback. It's usually done face-to-face. Lately, people have started using email as a means of giving feedback. Some people like to give not only the sort of verbal feedback, but they like to send graphs. So here's how your performance looks over time. Telling them what they did well, areas that need to be improved, and showing them the data seems to work a bit better than anyone alone. But some teachers don't, some implementers, not just teachers, some implementers don't like graphs of their performance. If they don't like it, don't do it. It's not necessary. And here's what happens, a fairly simple example of what happens when we use performance feedback. In this case, all 4 teachers were trained to implement with 100% integrity. And this was an adherence measure. They were trained to do it with 100% accuracy. Then they were told, all right, go back to your classrooms and implement. One teacher did pretty good. She took it seriously. That's great. The other 3 teachers, they thought it was a suggestion more than a mandate, and they kind of didn't like the suggestion, and their performance fell apart. So they went to a performance feedback system. Teacher 1 and teacher 3 benefited. Their implementation got far, far better. Teacher 2 didn't benefit. And as you can see, a more intensive kind of intervention was necessary, and that teacher was not able to complete the study. And we don't talk about that in public. But it's not bad. If 25% of my folks directly benefit from training, 3/4 benefit from training plus feedback, I've had an impact. Karen set the goal as either 50%, 60%, I don't know. I don't know what's a reasonable goal. But now I know that I'm going to have to apply some fairly substantial resources here. Performance feedback systems, once you build them, they're not that hard to keep going, but you got to build them, and you got to have systems in place to make sure people actually give the feedback, and we'll get into that. But this is a hopeful approach, just performance feedback. Here was performance feedback to a group of student study teams when they got feedback that they were following decision-making protocols. Their implementation of the protocols got better. Again, most of us in teams, one of the things that happens is we tend to blame other people for the poor student performance rather than following decision-making protocols. Here's what we know about performance feedback. More frequent is better. Daily is better than weekly, but you get effects providing feedback weekly. Immediate is better than delayed, and folks receiving the feedback generally prefer immediate over delayed. And I think there's a fairly straightforward explanation for that. For most of us, being observed and having our performance reviewed by someone else is intrusive and uncomfortable. The longer you have to wait to get the feedback, the more worry there is, the more stress there is, and immediate feedback closes the window that you have to stress and worry about what the results are going to be. So when I was running the systems, you had to give feedback before that individual that you observed left for the day. If they left at 4 o'clock, then you had to get feedback to them by 4. That was it. And you had to, in our system, we had data on every single staff person at least once a month across any number of dimensions of implementation. There was a huge systems intervention, but everybody got feedback across a number of variables at least once a month. And we had almost 500 staff, between 400 and 500 staff, so this was not a small little feedback system. Performance feedback systems do have their limitations. They usually require direct observation. Some folks can use permanent products, but a lot of our interventions don't really have permanent products, so we have to do some kind of direct observation. It may make them too resource intensive to implement at very large scale. If you're going to do a performance feedback system at large scale, you're going to have to restructure the system where everybody gets involved in performance feedback. A lot of folks don't like performance feedback systems. And what we found in our work was performance feedback systems work well if you meet a couple of criteria. Feedback has to be nested in a whole culture of feedback. Everybody in the system got performance feedback about their responsibilities, about their behavior. Whether it's instructional assistants and teachers in the classroom, it was mid-level managers, or me as the clinical director, I got feedback about my performance. Was I accomplishing the things that were necessary to keep this system running? The other rule that we had, and I think it's absolutely critical, is that performance feedback is about solving a problem and improving outcomes for students. We do not use performance feedback as evaluation. It doesn't go in your personnel file. You're not going to hear about it at your end-of-year review. This is about all of us working together to make sure students benefit. And it cannot be, the data from these observations cannot be used in your annual performance review. That's a violation of trust. Because now it's being used for two purposes, and that's not nice. One's an overt, explicit, and the other's a hidden agenda. And you just can't do that and have any credibility with the folks you're working with. An alternative approach is coaching. It's very similar to performance feedback, except now somebody's actually in the classroom demonstrating, prompting, and giving feedback. Obviously, it can be resource intensive. And coaching, not everybody can be a good coach. There's a very specific skill set to being a good coach. If you're going to be a good coach, you have to be perceived as credible by the person that you're coaching. If they don't perceive you as credible, they're not going to take your feedback very well. They're not going to believe your demonstrations. The focus has to be on problem solving, and you have to work on mutually agreed upon goals. If the teacher says, I don't want to work on that, you don't work on that right now. You work on what you can work on, and essentially what you're going to do is sneak up on the really important things. But first, you've got to have the teacher trust you if you're going to be a coach. So you've got to find ways to have mutually agreed upon goals that you can work on. A very attractive alternative for increasing treatment integrity is self-monitoring. But you saw the data that suggested that we generally overestimate how well we're doing. But there are things we can do to make self-monitoring better. One is record our behavior over much shorter periods of time. Like by the end of an instructional session, immediately record what you did in that session then. If it's around running a behavior management plan, complete it after 15 minutes, 30 minutes. Don't have individuals rate for half a day, because that generally your accuracy is only based on your most recent interaction with the kid, not what you've done all day. And there's some data to suggest that reviewing video recording, having the teacher or implementer review videos of themselves implementing and scoring their behavior on video, improves quality of implementation. Ed Daly did some interesting work allowing participants to choose the elements of an intervention. There's lots of ways of solving the problem. Let those responsible for implementing choose from a menu of empirically supported practices so they can implement what is the best contextual fit in their classroom. The constraint is it has to come from this list of empirically supported interventions. Now, what we have to do is figure out how to use our resources wisely, and that's going to require a systems approach. And I want you to think about it like this. Most of us accept axiomatically that students are going to be only as good as the teacher in their classroom. As a parent, you always try to get who's the good teacher in third grade because I want to make sure my kid gets that teacher. So we accept that teachers make a difference. Well, let's extend that logic. If students are only going to be as good as the teacher, then I would make the argument that teachers are only going to be as good as the support system they're working in within the school. And schools are only going to be as good as the support system from the district. And ultimately, in an idealized world, districts are only going to be as good as the support system coming from the state education agency. And here's all we need to do to make sure these systems work. We have to have student performance data flow up. Classroom teacher is going to be interested in individual students and how his or her class is doing. The school principal is going to be interested in how classrooms and the whole school is doing. The district is going to be interested in how schools are doing. And the state's going to be interested in how the whole state is doing. But the other thing we need, in order to make sense of the student performance, we're going to need data about how well folks are implementing the plans. And I don't mean just the plan between the teacher and the student. I mean the plan between, if teachers are going to be good, they need a support plan. Does the school building have a support plan for teachers? Do they actually implement it? Does that support plan make sense? Similarly, does the district have a plan to support schools implementing the support plans for teachers so that teachers can implement plans for students? And that's the logic. So it would work like this. Student data flows up to the classroom teacher. Teacher can't make sense out of that data unless the teacher knows something about how well he or she implemented. So that data has to flow down from the school. Somebody at the school level needs to be monitoring integrity. Data flows up from the classroom to the school. Those data can only be understood in the context of how well the school is implementing their support plan. So you get the logic. At every step, there's data coming up and there's data coming down. And that's ultimately what we want to see happening. The data gets aggregated differently, but you're still checking to see if people are actually implementing their support plan. Lots of us in administration make promises, oh yes, I will support you, this is a really important initiative, and you never see me again. That is not a support plan. Promises aren't support plans. So we have to actually deliver. One way to do this is a multi-tiered system of support. Most of you are familiar with multi-tiered systems of support for students. Everybody gets a universal intervention. Some kids require other levels, more intensive levels of support, and some kids require really intensive levels of support. Brandy Simonson and her colleagues at Connecticut have used exactly this model for improving teachers' implementations in the classroom. Some teachers benefit by training, some by feedback, some require coaching. That's their usual tiers. So just as closing thoughts, assuring high levels of treatment integrity, I think, is an ethical responsibility. High levels of treatment integrity are absolutely necessary to benefit from empirically supported interventions. There's some emerging approaches to suggest that we can, in fact, actually impact quality of implementation. But it's going to require efforts from every level of the system. And that treatment integrity, then, is everybody's business. And that's what I have to say. I think we have some time. So if there's questions, comments, I'm sure some of you could have figured out much smarter ways to talk about treatment integrity, but that's at least my view, informed by 40 years of failure. So I'd be happy to hear comments or questions. Yes? Thank you. Thank you for the positive feedback. Let's quit there. No. Any other questions? One of the things my parents taught me is when you hear the right answer, quit talking. And that's served me going into IEP meetings is incredibly important. Once you get people to agree, quit talking, get them to sign. Yes?
When teachers are being observed, do you find it best to have some kind of structured before or an open-ended type of observation? What suggestions do you have?
I think it's important that teachers know what they're being observed about, so we did very structured observations, because if it's open-ended, I don't know what you're looking for, so I can't improve my performance, and it's really scary, because then it can become what you think of me, not what my behavior was about. So objective measures of behavior are far better than this kind of open-ended. And we have an agreement up front. These are the things we're looking to improve. Praise, opportunities to respond, whatever it may be. But everybody knows what performance you're looking to impact. Other questions, comments? Yes? Yeah. Well, I think one of the things, depending on the level where you're trying to slice in, school-wide positive behavior supports has some nice tools. The SET evaluation tells you it's school evaluation tool. Tells you how the school is doing as a whole. It doesn't tell you how any individual teacher within the system is doing, but it tells you how that school as a whole is performing. And they have nice data. Schools that score 80% or higher on the SET get about a 25% reduction in office referrals relative to schools that perform below the 80% criteria. So again, you always have to look at the interaction between student outcomes and your integrity measures. So I think the SET is a great measure. Unfortunately, right now, a lot of what we end up having to do is make our own to address the issues that we're trying to address within the system. And I know. And then you don't know anything about the validity of the measure, but it's a place to start. And there may be other tools. I'm sure there are other tools out there. I can't think of her name right now. Has some nice. Lisa Sinetti has some nice tools for checking classrooms. Sinetti and Cradwell edited a really nice book just on treatment integrity. I would encourage you to look at that book. I get no kickbacks from recommending it. So, but they also in that book have some tools. Yes? Yeah, one of the things I've learned is that if you don't keep your foot on the pedal all the time, integrity goes away incredibly fast. So we tended to check fidelity weekly for most things. A couple of things we could check every couple of weeks. For dosage, we really did just go in. Is there supposed to be a session starting now? Is it starting? And we come back 30 minutes later or however later it was supposed to end and come back and see, are they still there? And are they actually engaged in the activity or are they now playing video games? And that's all we did is just, are you following the schedule? It was start on time, end on time, and are the activities in between what they're supposed to be? Is it focused on reading, for example? We tried to keep checking dosage as simple as possible. So it was really just a up, down, start on time, end on time kind of measure. But that was sufficient for most of the things we were trying to get at. with the dosage and exposure. Again, if you're wanting to measure dosage in antibiotics, you just count, did you take the right number of pills today? And then you'd have to worry about, did you take them all at once, or did you spread them out every 8 hours or so? But that's an adherence problem. First off, did you just take the right number of pills today? Did you get the proper dosage? Then we'll worry about adherence later. And a lot of this, again, we just had to make up on the fly. And I always look for cheap and easy. That's what I always look for in my girlfriends, too. That's terrible. My wife would kill me if I said that. So there will be a thing you sign on the way out, that nothing that gets said here gets repeated outside these walls. So, please. Because I worked very hard to convince her that she was neither cheap nor easy. And I have the data to prove she was not cheap. Other quick questions or comments? Yes? Did you ever use stages of concern or levels of concern? Yeah, we played around with a bit. I think if we were smarter, we would have done a lot more of that kind of work. The question was, did we use stages of concern kind of questionnaires? And yeah, because that really helps you figure out where everybody in the system is ready to slice in within their essentially scope of responsibility. And again, if we would have been smarter, we would have done more of that. So I would recommend doing that kind of assessment as part of your systems level intervention. Because not all systems are ready to do the same things, and not all parts of the system are ready. Comments, questions, going once, twice? I'm done.